Today our topic is really housing and housing affordability, specifically in the context of Texas. But broadly, the character of urban growth and change, particularly over the last 10, 15 years, has put a tremendous amount of pressure on cities within urban regions, the kind of core of urban regions, in terms of housing affordability. People are moving back to the city. It's putting a lot of upward pressure on land prices, particularly in cities that are growing significantly. So housing affordability really has kind of risen up the priority list in terms of a major issue that many cities are attempting to deal with. In the context of Texas, as sort of somewhat unsurprisingly, has not had an aggressive state approach to affordable housing. And of course, at the federal level, funds and programming for affordable housing development has been really sort of going down with a few periods of stabilization since the 1980s. So Professor Liz Mueller, our speaker today, has done about a 2.5-year research project on affordable housing issues in Texas. And she's looked at the major urban areas in Texas in kind of broad context and policy context. And she has some really interesting and revealing information about the affordable housing crisis in Texas cities and the policy response or lack thereof. Liz Mueller and I we know each other quite well, and she has a PhD in Berkeley from planning and has worked at the state of Texas for looking at foreclosure rates. She served on a state commission. She's also recently finished, and maybe she can talk a little bit about this, was it commission or a task force on incentives for affordable housing development in Austin. That task force has just hatched some recommendations for changes in incentive structures and so on in the city of Austin. So let me turn it over to Ms. Mueller.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. And as Michael said, I'm going to talk about a project I've been working on for the last few years. And it was really aimed at trying to put together a sort of bigger picture view of what are our affordable housing needs and how can we talk about them and think about a sort of a vision for where we want to go and what we need to do to get there. Because usually when we talk about affordable housing or plan for it, we're responding to requirements that the federal government has for reporting on its funds or other things. And it's often done in a way that's hard for the general public to engage in. It's very jargony and very specific, and people who are involved in it know what it is, and everyone else is not quite sure what you're talking about. So this was supposed to be, let's think bigger picture and talk about it. And I was trying to put together information on needs and on what cities are doing and on the sort of bigger picture for how to think about what we could do that would be useful to people in these cities in fostering some sort of discussion about housing and housing priorities. Okay, let's see. Okay. But first, the context for this discussion, as Michael mentioned, the federal funding has been on a sort of long-term decline that probably, most likely will continue. But federal money has historically been the only way that we're able to really reach people who are at the lowest income levels. It's really the only source of deep subsidy. So that's a troubling trend as we move forward. As he said also, housing is not really a favored area in Texas state policy. We spend a really small amount of money on it. That's our state's money as opposed to passing through federal funds compared to other states. I think at the peak we had $12 million in our state trust fund to cover a 2-year period, and that's, other cities have, 10 times that in a trust fund. So it's really pretty pitiful. And so part of the emphasis for this was that I was involved with a statewide network of people called the Texas Housing Forum that really want to make housing more of a priority at the state level and are interested in information to help them make the case for that. Another piece of the context in Texas is that, as I'm sure you're all becoming aware through being in the planning program, planning is also weak at the state level in terms of legislation. We don't have enabling legislation or mandates that other states have to do comprehensive plans in cities. In many states, states that emphasize growth management require planning and require a housing element in that plan that requires you to look at population growth over time, project forward, think about whether or not you have enough land zone to meet different types of housing needs. That really makes it a lot easier for a city to take on those tasks. We don't have that here. And also, if you don't have those things coming down from higher levels to kind of push you to look at issues, it's all following at the local level, and in most cities, equity concerns are politically pretty weak. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to go through some information on ways to look at what the biggest housing challenges are in Texas cities, looking at where people actually find affordable places to live now, what are the different things that support that, and then how well do funding sources match needs? I mean, we have funds that allow us to do certain things. Where are there holes in that? And how well then are cities doing at trying to fill those gaps or at targeting what they do have to reach needs? And then we can have some discussion about what we ought to do. So first, housing challenges facing the city. So I looked at things like what's the balance between owning and renting within cities, what's going on within the rental market, where are the biggest affordability challenges, how affordable is home ownership, and what about low-income homeowners? So the first thing is, in Texas in particular, we hear an awful lot about home ownership, and nationally that's been a big push for quite a long time. And we really don't talk about renters very much. But in our largest cities, renters are the majority. In Houston, Dallas, and Austin, I guess this is the pointer. Below half of the population are renters. Oh wait, I don't have the, okay, this is not showing you that, but in the largest cities, the majority of residents are renters. In lower cost cities like San Antonio and El Paso, the majority are homeowners. But, renters are a huge share of the population in cities and really are ignored when we think about planning issues and housing issues. We're always talking about moving people to home ownership. But really, people go through a housing life cycle. Most of us at some point in time are renters, or it's appropriate for us to be renters. And we really need to think more systematically about renters as a group and not as a temporary condition we want everyone to move out of quickly. But renters are also a lot lower income than the general population, and certainly than homeowners. And a lot of the renters in our cities are low income. So this shows you the share of all renters in cities that have incomes less than $35,000 in the year 2005. So, El Paso, which is a much poorer city, of course, has a huge share. But in all the cities, really, the share of renters that are under $35,000 in annual income for their household approaches around 60%. And there's also a significant share of renters that earn less than $20,000 a year across cities. And El Paso, once again, is very high, but the other cities are between 30 and 40% of all renters. So renters as a group are fairly low income. And then if you look at the renters that have a high cost burden, and in this case it's defined as paying more than 35% of their gross monthly income for their rent and utility costs together. So of all renters, more than 30%, more than a third across all the cities fall in that category of paying very high costs and having a relatively low income. So it's a pretty large-scale problem, this unaffordability of rental housing. Okay, in terms of home ownership then, the big picture shows us that we have a problem. I think we're all aware of this in terms of here's where you can see the home ownership rate. That red line is at the 50% mark, so you can see the first bar is the city home ownership rate. You can see Houston, Dallas, and Austin are below 50% in the share of city residents that are homeowners, but then you can also see that there's a big difference between city and county rates. And this actually understates the difference because the county rate is including the city population. So if you were to, and I haven't figured out how to untangle that yet, but if you were to be able to look at the city residents versus the suburban residents, the gap would be much greater. So, we have this gap between where homeowners live, and then we have some evidence that over time this may get worse because this affordability index is actually an index that's trying to measure for first-time home buyers whether or not it's affordable for them to buy a house in the metropolitan area. And we know in Austin that it's pretty unaffordable for, the way they define this was done at Texas A&M at their real estate center. This is for a household that's in the lowest quartile of households. So if you had everybody and you divided it into 4 groups, the bottom 25%, or the people at that 25th percentile of households, what could they afford to buy? And then they've compared it to the bottom quarter segment of home prices. And any score that's higher than a 1, I know this is a lot of information on one slide, but if you're above this 1 level, that in theory means that that people at that level do have enough income to buy one of the most inexpensive houses in the region. But those houses, we know, are becoming farther and farther out. They're really at the far edges of the region. So we're pushing people farther and farther out of cities. I don't have a graphic to show you, where first-time home buyers are buying, but I've seen in the past some home builders put together data that showed where subdivisions were that had homes below a certain price point, and they were increasingly, farther out. So we're getting into a situation where home ownership is relatively much more expensive within cities than outside of cities. New households wanting to buy homes for the first time are being pushed farther and farther out. And then we do have some remaining long-term low-income homeowners in the city, but I'll talk about in a minute what's facing them. But, if we're seeing a trend where home ownership is meaning, movement outward, that's working against all the planning goals that we're talking about through Envision Central Texas and, all kinds of measures of sustainability. It also, there's a limit to how much this can happen, if you take in transportation costs, which the Center for Neighborhood Technology has developed this measure of affordability that includes transportation costs and shows that, as you move out farther and farther, the trade-off starts to work against you. You may have a house out there, but over time, your transportation costs are really kind of undermining that affordability. So these are not good trends for us as planners. Then if we look about, what about the existing owners in cities that have very low incomes? And there's a surprisingly large share of people who fall into this group. So this is looking at the share of all owners in a city in 2005. The blue bar is the owners that had incomes below $35,000 a year. So in all cities except Austin, that was at least 30% of all of the owners in the city. This next one is the owners that have incomes below $20,000, and it's falling between 10 and 20% of all owners in the city. And then again, if we look at the share of low-income owners, people earning below $35,000 that have high costs, it's between 10 and 20% more or less. So a significant share of people are having trouble paying for their housing who are long-term owners who've probably been in their neighborhoods for a long time and are now, their incomes are not rising as fast. And we know, because we've heard a lot about this, that property taxes are one of the big issues. And I actually was able to look in the American Community Survey. You can see how many households have a cost burden, and you can see how many don't have a mortgage at all and still have one. And of the low-income households that report having a high cost burden, or that they're paying more than a third of their, or more than 30% of their income in this cases for their mortgage, taxes and insurance, across cities, about a third of that is explained by just the taxes and insurance part, because people don't have a mortgage and they're still paying this very high share of their income just for the taxes and insurance. And Austin, when I dissected this, had the worst problem. 40% of the low-income owners that had high costs, it was explained by the taxes issue because they didn't have mortgages. So that is a troubling trend. And then another issue is foreclosure. In the past, the big problem was access to credit in low-income communities, and we have the Community Reinvestment Act, and we did all these things to push to make sure that we were getting lending in these communities. Now the problem is not access to credit, it's terms of credit. And so Texas is a leader in terms of subprime lending, or lending that has much higher interest rates than conventional loans. And so we're getting into more trouble now because of that. We don't have as many of the sort of fancy interest-only loans and things that a state like California has, but we still have a lot of subprime lending, and it's concentrated in particular areas. I was on this panel that Michael mentioned that the state legislature appointed to look at the problem in the state in the largest cities. And across cities, Dallas had the worst problem by far. We looked at, for a 4-year period, all the mortgages that went into foreclosure in these different cities as a percentage of all mortgages in those cities. And in Dallas, it was over 5% of all the mortgages held in the city foreclosed in that period of time. So that's a troubling trend. And then we looked at census tracts to see if there were certain types of areas that tended to have a higher rate of foreclosure. And we found that they were neighborhoods that were low income compared to the city, where there was a higher concentration of minority residents, and where there was a higher concentration of these high rate loans. So that is also a troubling trend. Okay, so in this context where we know that these are the problems that are going on, where do people find affordable places to live now? How are we providing affordable housing, and how well is that matched to what we're seeing are the problems? So this is another chart packed with lots of information, but what I tried to do here was put together the number of different types of subsidized housing that we have. So vouchers, public housing, project-based Section 8, which is a program that no longer is constructing any housing, but did in the 70s and 80s. And this last one is the housing built with the low-income housing tax credit. So I was able to get the numbers of housing units we support with those. The first bar here, which is so big and so important, is affordable unsubsidized apartments. So how many apartments currently house people who earn less than half of the median income, which is the bulk of renters, and often renters who really need affordable housing at a price they can afford. And right now, that's really a very important part of the stock of affordable housing, affordable rental housing in our cities. And this is a really important point because, you could see Houston and Austin have, the greatest reliance on that. But it's a very important point because it relates so strongly to planning. As I mentioned before, we don't have state mandates that make us think about, do we have enough land zoned for apartments or for, smaller lots, or, the different things we need to make sure we have different prices of housing in our market. If we're providing a lot of this currently through the multifamily housing that we have to make sure we're keep bringing more of that online over time, that we have land zone that will allow for the construction of apartments, that we're thinking about that as we grow. And zoning land for multifamily is not always very popular, as we know. So that's a significant challenge. Okay, then the other thing to note about this slide is that, we see, first of all, it's so important to have that the stock of unsubsidized housing is very important, but then when you look at the other patterns, it's very hard to pick out consistent patterns. So, El Paso is striking for how reliant it is on public housing. San Antonio is interesting because it has a lot of vouchers, a lot of tax credit units. There doesn't seem to be a kind of common theme here. And in trying to think about why these come up, it's not... to me, it started making me think about how we get these different stocks of units. And, we don't get them in a way that we're thinking about it all at the same time and trying to put together an overall picture that makes sense. Some of it's historical, how much public housing you got. Redevelopment of that might lead you to get more vouchers. Dallas also got vouchers because they were sued in a famous case where that part of the settlement was more vouchers. So you get this mix that's not necessarily about what you need. It's kind of what you can get, what's available, and your different funding sources. And so, that I think is a problem, because if you look at this and you think about income targeting, the vouchers in public housing are going to allow you to serve households that are extremely low income in HUD's terms, people below 30% of the regional median income, kind of a rough measure of poverty. The tax credits will allow you to reach people who are more around half of the median income, typically. The private units are probably going to be sort of in between there, or maybe higher than there. So, that it may or may not be correlating well with what your need really is. And in most cities, there's a tremendous need for households, serving households who are at the poverty level. There's never enough housing for that group. Okay, this is just kind of making the same point for people who are not graphically oriented. But there is one new point on this page, which is that we also found that affordable options tend to be geographically concentrated, often in minority neighborhoods. And that's another issue that we really have to think about as planners, because if we're going to provide housing opportunities for people, that means giving people access to quality public services, quality schools, transportation, access to employment. We need to be thinking about distributing opportunities throughout the region rather than concentrating them. And I'll show you an example of one of the maps that we did to try and look at this in more detail. For Austin, we identified neighborhoods that had clusters of one particular type of subsidized affordable housing, which is housing built with the low-income housing tax credit, which is a federal program that encourages investment in affordable housing. So we found census tracts, or areas that had clusters of at least 5 tax credit apartment buildings. And then we looked at the characteristics of those census tracts and compared them to the city as a whole. And Kate Bushman, who I think some of you know was the student who did this mapping, did a great job. So you could see citywide what the ethnic breakdown is, with the green being white, the brown being Hispanic, and the white being black. So in these tracts, they're very highly minority relative to the citywide averages. So, and you can see they're all on the east side. And if you look also, I think she's also got all tax credit properties on this map. There's only one that's ever made it west of Mueller, and that was, not so easy to get it over there. So we're having tremendous difficulty spreading these opportunities around. And another thing we found in doing the research on this project was that cities don't really have much incentive to look at this themselves and do this kind of analysis themselves. The federal government does require them to do something called an analysis of the impediments to fair housing study, but they don't really follow up on it, and so a lot of cities don't really even do it. Or if they do it, they don't do a very thorough job and come up with an action plan, or they don't look at how their own policies do or don't contribute to fair housing concerns. So that was a troubling trend. Okay, so we talked a minute ago about the importance of private unsubsidized apartments and the issue of needing to make sure that those are replaced over time. And, part of why some of these apartments are affordable is that they're aging, and so they become more affordable over time. Of course, the limit of that is, the only way you're going to get very, very, very affordable housing is to have extremely bad condition housing. So it's not going to solve all the problems, but you need to have a certain stock of these older units. But they are going to eventually need to be replaced. They're going to get too old, and they'll be redeveloped. So the issue comes up, what's the age of the stock of these apartments that we have? And so if you look at all apartments in different markets, and then look at the number that were constructed before 1980, you can see the breakdown. And Houston has a very large stock of old apartments. Austin, in relative terms, looks like it has a lot of newer apartments relative to older ones, but still, over 50,000 units of these older apartments. So that's something we have to think about, and planning is very strongly related to that, because it's not just the age of the buildings that determines if they're going to be redeveloped, it's where they are. So, we had this battle in the fall over the redevelopment of the Stone Ridge Apartments on South Lamar, which was in a very good location. So it was appealing to redevelop it and to use the vertical mixed use, new zoning category to do that and use those incentives. So, we have to think about, as we're putting in place different policies to encourage redevelopment of certain areas, how are we going to deal with the loss of these affordable units, which are currently not subsidized, but would be very expensive to replace if we had to replace them completely. There are also threats to aging subsidized affordable housing. Public housing, much of our public housing stock is quite old, and as the operating support for running public housing continues to decline, there's more and more issues with that. So there's a lot of threats to the existing stock that we have that could be quite expensive to address if we can't somehow maintain them when we have to replace them. So, and this is just a very crude measure to give a sense of, the context for losing any units. If you look at the number of households who are defined by HUD as extremely low income, that's basically, poor households, and the number of apartments in a market, whether subsidized or not, that are affordable to them, this is, if you just subtracted those two numbers, this is what you would get in terms of a shortage. So in Houston, there's already a lack of about 50,000 units for people at that income category. So that means those households are paying a lot more for their housing. And these are really underestimates of what the shortage is, because when you look at this information, which HUD calculates using the 2000 census, it shows you how many units there are that potentially that are affordable to this group, and then it tells you what share are actually occupied by people at that income level. Typically about half of the units are occupied by people with higher incomes who just got a great deal, and they're not going to move out. So the shortages are actually worse. So, the context for losing any units affordable to this group is that, we can't afford it. We have to figure out how to keep everything we can rather than need to try and replace it through new construction. So in terms of needs and stock, this is, just kind of the main points I just covered. Rents are really out of reach for a significant amount of renters, and for people who are extremely low income, a lot of them actually pay more than half of their small incomes for their housing, leaving them very little for other needs. Entry-level homeowners are increasingly looking outside of cities, moving out to the fringe, which is working against a lot of our other planning goals. Low-income owners who remain in the city, there's a growing portion of them that are facing problem paying for their taxes. Many of them are older. And we're risking, we have a large share of unsubsidized housing that we actually depend on to meet our housing needs. And we need to think about that as it ages and try and figure out strategies that can help us, prevent the loss of it. Because if we have to replace it, the cost is so much higher that, if you look at the incentives that are going to be recommended, or the ones that we have through vertical mixed use, they target the subsidized or the affordable units at 80% of median income, which seems reasonable to the developers given the development costs, but is really not hitting, where the need is. Okay, so what do we know about funding, though, and how cities are funding their affordable housing production? What areas currently lack resources? So we tried to come up with some sense of the pace of production that cities are able to sustain using the different resources they have now. And this was a fairly difficult process. For each city, we tried to put together data for a 5-year period and calculate an average number of units that were being produced by cities using any of the federal resources they had, so that we could then compare that to a measure of need. And so we looked at in the year 2000, how many households were paying more than half their income for housing? What was that number? And then if this annual pace we calculated, could they produce enough units to hit that backlog in a 20-year period? And none of the cities could. I mean, they're just not able to go at a pace. It's so expensive, and even if they're doing the maximum they can with the resources they have, they're just not going to be able to do that. So there's a big gap there. One of the programs that produces the most units is the federal low-income housing tax credit program, which the cities don't have direct control over. Those tax credits are actually allocated by the state housing agency through a competitive process, and individual developers will work through those plans and discuss them with the city. But whether or not, in many affordable housing projects, who's going to be certified is determined by the funding source and by the motivation of the developer doing it. Because if you're going to reach lower and lower levels, you have to decide that you're going to do that, and you're going to go after the additional layers of subsidy you need to do that. So city can be supportive of a tax credit developer who wants to put in a new project and is just going to use the tax credits, which means they'll hit that 50 to 60% of median band. But if the need in the city is really for lower, they can't. That's up to that developer to try and be motivated to be looking for those resources. So in some places like Houston, there's a glut of these tax credit units, and when the Katrina hurricane hit, there were actually a lot of vacant ones there. They had too many at that one income level, and they weren't, getting it down to where the need was. So, so we can look at just measures of the amount of production, and then there's some problems maybe with, even if we got a lot of something, maybe it's not helping. But what we do know that we have very few units typically produced for extremely low-income households. So that issue of layering is really important, and one of the things that cities have that can help them try and push somebody to go to that lower level or enable a project to reach that lower level is a federal block grant called the Home Block Grant that all cities over 50,000 in population get through a formula. So we looked at, we wanted to see, well, how are cities doing it using that money? It's typically a sort of gap financing. They help a project by adding this layer in. It enables them to reach a lower income level in who they're serving. And everyone will tell you, oh, it's just so expensive to hit the 30% of median group. We just can't do it. And luckily, we have this information that HUD collects that shows what's the average for how other cities do it. So there's some basis for comparison. And so what we're looking at here is what share of these funds Texas cities dedicated to serving either people below half of median income or 30% of median income compared to the national average of cities in use of these funds. And none of the cities in Texas even approached, well, San Antonio came the closest, I guess, the U.S. average for targeting these poor households. And Austin and Houston appear to be doing the worst. Then, in terms of how well they're doing at reaching households below half of median, getting a little bit closer, but still there's some gaps there. And I'm not really sure what the reason is. And, another issue is cities also get community development block grant monies, and some cities may be compensating because they can use that for housing. So Austin spends a lot of that money on housing, and they do seem to be compensating somewhat because they target that money lower. Other cities like Dallas, they don't seem to be targeting anybody in this group with their CDBG funds either. So they've just got a big problem. In thinking about what's going on with this targeting, I think, to me it made me think about this image of connecting the dots, that it's very hard to put together these resources that are all coming from different places. So you've got the tax credit money that's given out in this competitive process to developers. You've got the block grant money that comes to your city and you have a process for setting priorities for. You have public housing, which is a separate bureaucracy. And, the federal resources, which are sort of an unknown right now. There's currently a push to get a National Housing Trust Fund, which people seem very hopeful about because of the change in the Congress now. And the idea now, I think, is that the funding for it would come somehow out of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac funds. I don't know exactly how. They keep changing the target for the funding for that. But if that were to happen, it would be targeted at poor households. It would make a huge difference. Suddenly there would be this federal money coming that could really help alleviate that problem. But that's a huge unknown. We don't know if that's going to happen. So if it doesn't, we're looking again at this home block grant. So we're having a problem somehow targeting that low enough. Public housing and vouchers, incredibly important to very extremely low-income families. Public housing program is kind of, under a continual threat because it just doesn't have much support in Congress. Vouchers have more support, but they're always a vulnerable program because they have to be renewed periodically in funding. We saw that there was this tremendous variation in how cities rely on these different sources. The tax credit program, remains popular, but there's this big problem in how it's allocated, that there doesn't really seem to be very well done process in terms of really considering the need for the projects. They do it in this sort of individual, make the case for your project market study approach, which is resulting in overbuilding in some places. And so, seems like a kind of waste of resources. So, what are cities doing? Cities in this context, if they're thinking big picture, then have to think, what can we do? What kind of source of funding can we get? And what can we do with it? And that has to happen within the context of local politics, where spending the money on the poorest people might not be as appealing as the first-time home buyer issue, or defining affordability or workforce housing in a different way. But it's still a way that cities can still raise some money. The gold standard, nationally, is that cities come up with some sort of dedicated revenue source, some way to create their own housing trust fund by usually some sort of real estate transfer tax or fee that, as things are booming, generates money that goes into this fund that can be used for housing. No city in Texas has got that, and the state trust fund doesn't have that either. So anybody who says they have a trust fund right now is getting it because they're getting their council or legislature to allocate general revenue into it periodically. So that means you have to continually fight that battle and compete against other needs for that funding rather than having an ongoing funding source. General obligation bonds, Dallas and Austin. We didn't have complete data for Houston yet, so it's not included here. Both Dallas and Austin had passed bonds for use with housing. In Austin, we just passed it in the fall, so we haven't even passed the ordinance yet that will govern how it's really going to be used. Austin has put general revenue into its trust fund on a fairly regular basis. 3 of the cities we found used incentives or fee waivers. Austin's Smart Housing Program is an example of that, where a developer can get a share of their different types of fees waived if they're producing housing affordable to households at 80% of median income. And the more, if you're looking at a subdivision, the larger the share of houses in the subdivision, up to 40%, I think, hitting that point, the more fees they get waived. They'll also give them help with rezoning as part of that process in exchange for affordability. Austin spends way more on that in terms of what they lose in fee waivers than any of the other cities. These other cities have these programs, but when you look at what they've actually spent, it's really minuscule. The other thing that I included as a resource here was this issue of capacity building of community housing development organizations. It's one of the little jargony terms in housing. And these are local nonprofits whose mission is affordable housing. So I included them as a resource because I think that they're the groups that are motivated to keep housing affordable over the long term, which means it's an ongoing resource for the community. Private developers may do affordable housing for various programs, but typically they're only required to keep it affordable for a set period of time, and then after that period, they can turn it over. So it's a benefit, really, to have a group that's mission is to keep it affordable so you don't face the cost then of dealing with that problem later on. And these are also the groups that are motivated to try and build in the different layers you need to really hit the most critical housing needs. And cities, I don't think any cities spend their own money, but they're allowed to spend some of their block grant money on this, if they see it as something important, but many of them are not. So Austin and Dallas were, but the other two were not. So, it's not a tremendously encouraging picture yet. Cities are starting to do something, but a lot of times what they're doing is sort of one shot or not a very large scale in an ongoing way here. Okay, this is just kind of the main points here that I've gone through. So I want to just stop and see if people want to talk about any of this, but I think in going through this process, I really think that one of the big challenges is how to get people to think about the big picture, how to engage city leadership, not just, the people who run housing agencies really don't have the ability to go to this big picture. There needs to be leadership from elected officials, from civic leaders in the community who are saying, this is an issue, we need to think about it comprehensively, we need to figure out what resources we need, and then we need to support getting those resources. And that we don't have, the current way that we get funds now doesn't really facilitate such a process. Cities could do more with the tools they have. They're typically, unless they get a dedicated resource, they're still going to face great difficulty in really reaching those lowest income groups. In some cities, if we just focus on, let's let the cities raise their own money to do this. A place like El Paso, or a city that has a pretty weak tax base and is a relatively poor city, they're not going to be able to raise a lot of their own money. Part of why we have part of the benefit of the federal program is it is redistributing money to places that don't have resources. And we need to do that kind of at the state level. We need a state active trust fund that's going to help a city like El Paso that has limited capacity to raise its own money. I guess I'll stop there. What I'm doing with this information now, I'll tell you, let me back up and tell you a little bit about this project and the process we went through, because we initially thought about this and thought, we need to put out this accessible information. So we're going to create a framework for grading cities, and we're going to put together all this information, and we're going to put it out there so people in those cities can use it to have a discussion. And so we went through this process. It turned out to be a lot harder than we thought to get all the information and figure out the measures and all that. And we developed report cards first for San Antonio, then for Dallas. And they were fairly critical. And when we went to those cities and talked to the city managers and people there, they were not really that happy to hear about this from us. And then, we talked to local advocates and groups that were interested in this that we thought might be the ones to kind of try and use the information to foster a discussion, but they really weren't broad-based enough. They were typically coalitions of people directly involved in housing in some way who had a relationship with the city that they could not afford to risk by angering them by presenting this information. So, after spending a lot of time doing this, we realized this isn't really going to work the way we thought it would. This information, if we put it out there, what seemed to be happening initially was just, that I was going to get a lot of fruit and vegetables thrown at me, and it wasn't really going to foster this great public conversation. So what I did, or what I'm trying to do now, is take it and put it into more of a cross-city context, so that you can look across cities and see, oh, okay, well, this is a similar pattern across places, or here's where there seems to be some real significant difference, and see if maybe foster more cross-city discussions, or all the cities wanted to know how they stacked up compared to each other, so that might also be interesting. That was the first thing. Well, how did El Paso do? Or, are we doing better than Austin? So the cross-city format seems to work better, and I think that the state, the Texas Housing Forum, is very interested in trying to use this information to foster more interest in the trust fund at the state level. But, it started out as a research project that was really a lot more about the information, and over time became more about the politics and about why aren't there stronger coalitions, and trying to understand why the way we had thought it might work didn't work, and now trying to kind of retool and figure out how to use the information in a different way to try and foster or, engage people and interest people in this taking a bigger picture look at it. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has questions, comments.
Have you looked at the other cities besides Austin? I know Austin is working on getting community land trusts in place.
Mm-hmm.
Have any of the other cities moved towards that way of making housing more affordable? Because when you look at all those cities, I don't know about El Paso and San Antonio. I know housing is less expensive than it is here in Dallas and Houston, but the cost of the land is the big issue. Many times if you look on a TCAD, you see a house that's like $75,000 and land is like $150,000.
Yeah.
So the community land trust, to me, really makes a lot of sense if we could kind of move in that direction.
To my knowledge, Austin is the farthest along in working on that, and the city is actually going to run the land trust program here.
Did they have to have some enabling legislation to make that possible? Or
I don't know.
At the state level?
You just have to get the taxing entities to agree. It's an issue of negotiating with your taxing entities.
Right.
Do people know what a community land trust is, what we're talking about now? Okay, the idea is that because land prices are so high, if you were able to take the land out of the equation when you were selling someone a house, they could just buy the structure, and a nonprofit land trust would own the land. And if they could negotiate with the taxing entities so that the property taxes would not rise as quickly, it could remain relatively affordable. So it's a way to give somebody a chance to buy a home. They won't build as much equity because a lot of times the equity you build is through the land value, but it's a step in, it's affordable, it's home ownership, and then and it remains affordable. It remains a stock of affordable homes. The land trust actually, there's different ways of setting it up, but they can sometimes buy it back when someone comes out, or there's different ways to run it. But that's the idea. So it helps in a context where you have very high land prices. If you can somehow sell people just the structure, and the land's owned by a nonprofit. But it took a long time for Austin even to get to where it is, and as far as I know, I don't think another city is moving toward that.
Where is Austin exactly? I've heard a lot about it.
There've been several meetings. I haven't been actually part of them. Are you?
Yeah, People Fund. It's going to be a branch of People Fund, and so it's like it's a nonprofit under. It's not part of People Fund, but Margo is overseeing it, and Lori's going to be the point person on it. And I think they're expecting to be able to really put it into place in the next year or so.
From my understanding, though, People Fund has a structure, but they don't have any money to buy any land. The city actually has.
Debating whether or not that will happen, because if it stays with the city, if there's no taxation, if it's with a nonprofit, there's still tax. So that's a big issue.
Yeah.
I don't think they've decided that.
Yeah. So there's been sort of two tracks. They've been talking, but there's some little tension, I think, around that.
My information's a bit biased.
In land trust, don't you typically have city contributing land, either from
that would
foreclosed
make it easier.
Properties or
State, any kind of
public land is contributed to the trust?
They've talked about it for the Mueller Airport site. I know that the plan is, I think, to have some of that be, some of the homes be part of the land trust. But I'm not sure who's paying for the land, because as part of the original deal with the master developer, they didn't work the land into that, unfortunately. But there are several cities that are working on land banks, so that they have land that they tried to make it easier to clear title to land in cases where it for years had been just sort of complicated because someone died without a will and there were too many heirs and things. And then that land is held by the city in a land bank, and then there are preferences given to nonprofits. You could have a preference, you could dedicate some of that to a land trust, or there are ways that you could try and use that. And Dallas piloted the land bank, and I think Houston now has one as well, and Austin through that Homestead Preservation District would be allowed to do that as well. I'm not sure what the status of that is. I guess they passed that legislation, and now I think they want to make some amendments to it in this session. And then the city council never designated such a zone within Austin because they didn't like features of the program. So hopefully we'll get one in the future and could use some of those tools. Me?
Yeah, very basic question. How is a household size considered in defining affordability? Because in theory, households can always cut back the total housing consumption in order to bring down the share of the housing cost.
Well, the measures of affordability are adjusted for household size. So usually when people put forward averages for places, they're using a figure that's for a family of 4. And then HUD calculates differences in what that income level would be or what the affordability would be based on changes in household composition. So, and it's easier to compensate for that if the higher your income level is. Once you're at a lower level, at a certain point you're going to do without essentials.
So you say you started this 2 years ago, and Katrina happened. So how did Katrina affect your research? Did you have to change a lot of numbers?
Well, I left, no. Well, I mean, a lot of the stuff we were collecting from the cities, there's a lag anyway in it, so it didn't really,
It's probably much higher.
Yeah, it didn't include Katrina people because the data was older than that. But also it was part of why we left Houston to be the last place we looked at, because Houston, frankly, when we started, it was HUD had just issued like a whole laundry list of findings against them for mismanagement and other things, and they were just in big trouble, and I thought, let's not start with that. Then Katrina happened, and I thought, oh man, so that's why they came at the end. And I still don't have complete data on Houston. So, but I'm sure their picture's going to be dramatically different now.
There was an article today in the New York Times about Katrina and how people in New Orleans are now, they come back, but many of them are leaving, and some of them were originally in Texas City.
Oh, really?
They're going back, and they're realizing that they just can't make it there, so they're going to come back, and I'm curious.
That's interesting.
That's ongoing.
Yeah. Well, I think, I really feel like in Houston, having the people, the Katrina evacuees come in some ways has really highlighted a lot of the issues I'm trying to emphasize here. The fragmentation and lack of coordination of the resources you're getting, and a lot of the kind of legacy of the way we've done things and the way we've cited things in the past being a huge problem for people who come and don't have cars, and difficulties accessing all kinds of things. So it's interesting to me just because I feel like it's really sort of exaggerating a lot of the problems and things we need to think about.
I mean, just to follow up on that Katrina thing, I mean, the Katrina population was heavily concentrated in Houston. Houston had this huge surplus of tax credit project stuff that was targeted, at 50, 60% MFI. But with the federal chits, Katrina evacuees could get access to those tax credit projects. Well, once those chits are gone and they move back or they want to stay, how's that going to work out? I mean, it seems like you're going to generate probably a lot of households at 30, 40% MFI, and they're not going to have the subsidy to access the tax credit projects.
No, I know, they're going to be evicted from those projects. I mean, there are already stories of evacuees being evicted at different points when there's been confusion over whether or not the FEMA support is ongoing, it's going to be a huge problem. And that's why every time they say it's going to end, it hasn't ended yet, because I think it's not clear at all how they're going to deal with that issue. And there is a huge concentration in Houston. And, Houston will be stuck, I mean, there's a tremendous push on the part of the state of Texas as well to get, increased funding of various sorts to try and address housing needs because they're afraid of that. Because the city of Houston and the state of Texas will just be sort of left holding the bag when that ends. And the existing options, there are vacant tax credit units, but people don't have the income to qualify for them. They're too poor. In fact, one of the interesting things that happened right after Katrina, there was a forum at the Capitol that I was invited to be on a panel at, despite the fact I really didn't know, I just took some data people gave me and made a presentation. Suddenly I became an expert on this. I kept getting invited to give that presentation again. But one of the things that came up in the conversations was the tax credit developers, the private developers who had tax credit properties, had to get an special exemption from the Treasury, I think, to rent to people who fell outside of the income guidelines, who were too poor to normally qualify. So they got this exemption so that they could put them there because they can afford it with their FEMA housing voucher. But that's, when they don't have a voucher, they won't qualify.
I suspect it's a giant nightmare, but have you looked at how homeless rates play into the equation?
I haven't. I mean, figures on homelessness are so problematic because how do you count people who don't have a place to live? There's all these different ways that cities try and go about it. But I didn't look at it. I could. I mean, I could find out what cities are saying their homeless population is, but it's really typically difficult to measure. And HUD has these different definitions of homelessness where it could be people living in shelters, it could be people doubled up. There's different definitions of homelessness, and the people who are doubled up somewhere are pretty hard to know who they are. So I didn't really, it's a whole other huge topic to really delve into.
When are you going to get this presentation to the legislature?
Well, I haven't had a lot of success when I go to present at committees of the legislature.
You say you have?
I have not.
Oh.
I mean, if you're invited to give testimony, it might be something, but otherwise, I find it to be pretty.
Well, my fear is that we're going to have more and more doubling up in the outer areas of the city, like in the areas where you have poor people and minority people, and we're going to just have the same problems over and over again if we don't do something about it. I have a question. Maybe I should know this from reading stuff in the paper, but all the condos and apartments that there's a living downtown, is there any of the units? I mean, I look and see, starting 200,000, I said, well, that doesn't sound affordable. But I guess if you're paying over $1 million, maybe 200, 300, it's affordable. But for most people, working people, it's not. And it's certainly not affordable for people who are 50, 80, or 30%.
Yeah.
What I thought. Do you know if any of them are actually?
Well, that's been really the big focus of this Affordable Housing Incentives Task Force that I was on. We were trying to come up with a policy for a trade-off. We can't require people to have affordable housing. It's illegal under Texas law to do inclusionary zoning.
Change the law.
Well, the home builders only made it illegal fairly recently, so it'd be kind of hard to undo. But so it's an incentive system. So the basic idea was we'll trade off density for affordability. They're currently limited in the Florida area ratio. They're allowed. So we'll tell them that if they want to go beyond that, they have to dedicate 10% of that additional space to families at a certain income level. So, we spent months wrangling over what was realistic, you know, what fees would they need waived, and so the income levels that that we ended up with for downtown, and so we did this for downtown, and we did it for what's called DMU, or downtown mixed use, and for other multifamily housing in the city and single-family housing. We came up with these different trade-offs. But for downtown, it's for rental housing, it will be 10% of the additional space has to be affordable to somebody at 80% of median income. So it's very high, really, compared to what the need is. It'll be lower than what the other things are. And then for home ownership, it's 120% of median income. You know, which I wasn't that thrilled with. But what the reality, I think, of the downtown home ownership stuff they're building is it's going to be condos for 1 or 2 person households, and the median income for a smaller household is less. You know, the prices will be, you know, it's still not terribly affordable. There will be some income mix downtown, but one of the recommendations we made is that the city actually owns a fair amount of land downtown, but the city used that land to try and get affordable units on it. But I don't know if those will be any better targeted. But one of the other things that the task force recommended is that you either do the units or you pay a fee per square foot into a trust fund that can then be used to develop affordable housing that I think is targeted lower. So some of them may just pay into the fee, and then we can use that money. It has to be used within a certain radius of downtown, within a certain time period. And if no projects come up, they can use it on, and then it can be used anywhere. So the targeting, you know, the problem is the reality of the construction costs now, and also the reality that we're having this conversation with developers who have all the information about costs and what it really is going to take for them, and the rest of us who have no idea. Their incentive is not to reveal everything. We don't know if they are or aren't. You know, it's just kind of a weird process, and it's an incentive-based process. So, if you know, they have to want to do it too.
Is there any discussion about housing trusts? So the city would buy units and then
Hold them in a trust.
Yeah.
Not as part of the incentives thing. I mean, that, you know, lots of things came up that people would say, that's not incentives, you know, so.
So it has the incentives, that's what you were focused on.
Yeah, that was our focus. But there's this downtown planning process, and I think affordable housing is going to be part of that as well, so maybe other things could be brought up in that context.
Well, I hear all the time that, well, there should be some housing that workers downtown can live in.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody that works downtown that will be able to afford anything.
Yeah, I know.
No. My only hope is that they overbuild and fall their asses and then have to sell for decent. I mean, it's right, I think. But I
Well,
happen.
right now, there's an awful lot of things they say they're going to build, but I suspect that, you know, they won't all really happen, and if they did, I think there would be too much. And I don't know, they all seem sure that these high-priced units are going to be gobbled up.
They live in great demand.
Yeah.
People from California are coming buying them.
That's the whole problem right there.
So we have to keep those people out.
I'm from California. He likes to blame all those things. Did you see the article in the paper the other day that said the biggest source of migrants to Austin are people from other areas of Texas? So just like
The high income ones are coming from California.
What?
The high income
Yeah.
migrants are coming from California.
Yeah.
But I mean, in the context of that, was there any discussion, I mean, probably, you know, half the cities of America, I would guess, have some framework whereby if developers do want to have a, you know, fairly drastic increase in floor area ratio, they just got to pay. It's not an incentive, it's just, it doesn't have anything to do with affordable housing per se. They have to pay something. They have to, you know, pay, so it could be a linkage fee or whatever. So if you get this huge variance and, you know, you're going to build, you know, a 40-story building that's zoned for 4 stories, you know, why not make them, you know, pay.
Well, that's what the idea of this is. I mean,
Yeah, but
they're
it's
gonna go
either
beyond
you do
that.
80%
Or
or
you pay.
then you pay.
No,
and,
or
you
you
know.
pay, it's either or. You either contribute the units or you pay into the fund.
It seems to me that it would be more sensible to just make them pay, because particularly in this market, it does not seem that sensible to me to try to generate housing affordable to people below 60 or 50% MFI in downtown, where land prices are
Well,
extraordinarily
we
high.
had, that was a big ongoing debate, and we agreed on these 3 core principles in this task force, and believe me, I mean, it took us months to agree on anything. But eventually we agreed that that as city policy, we ought to be prioritizing long-term affordability, depth of affordability, and geographic dispersion of opportunities. And so, ironically, units downtown was considered geographic dispersion because there aren't, we're afraid there aren't going to be any opportunities downtown. So there were a lot of people who were just opposed to, who just desperately want some units to be affordable downtown, and so they would not give away that option. But having, we'll see with the fee. If the fee is set too low relative to the other thing, we're just going to get mostly fee, and we'll have to see over time how that works out.